I have played every single numbered Resident Evil game other than 0. As such, I do not feel qualified to give a full ranking of all the Resident Evil games, but with the recent release of Resident Evil Requiem, I do feel qualified to rank the modern Resident Evil games. Now, what does that include? It includes every Resident Evil game since the series was reborn in 2017 with Resident Evil 7, not counting the terrible multiplayer games because who cares? So, let's get started. Dead last in the ranking goes to Resident Evil 3 Remake. Now, here's the funny thing. This is the only game in the series that I've actually platinumed, so clearly I spent a lot of time with it. That probably tells you everything about the strange relationship I have with this game, because despite sitting at the bottom of the list, it's still fun. The biggest issue I have with it is how short it is. You can clear this thing in a single evening without really rushing, and if you've played the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, the missing content becomes impossible to ignore, with entire sections being removed. But then there is the Nemesis himself. In theory, Nemesis should be the star of the show, the towering bioweapon hunting Jill Valentine through the streets of Raccoon City. Sounds like a perfect setup for relentless tension, but in this remake, he's almost completely scripted. He shows up exactly when the game wants him to, chases you for a short stretch, and then disappears again. It's baffling when you think about what Resident Evil 2 Remake pulled off with Mr. X. That guy felt like a constant presence, stomping around the police station. Nemesis could have worked in the same way, but instead most of his appearances feel like set pieces rather than a threat that's genuinely hunting you. Because of that, the game never really gets scary. There are intense moments, sure, but that creeping dread the series is known for never fully arrives. You're usually sprinting through explosions or boss fights, rather than carefully managing space and resources. And the whole project has the lingering feeling that it was riding on the momentum of Resident Evil 2 Remake's success. RE2 Remake came out, everyone loved it, and suddenly we had a follow-up that felt kind of like a companion piece. That short runtime actually makes the game ridiculously replayable though. Once you know the routes, once you understand where the big fights are, blasting through the game again becomes quite addictive. I think this is the most easily replayable Resident Evil game, which is probably why I ended up getting that platinum. Next up, we've got Resident Evil Village, and I want to make this very clear right away. I really like this game. The only reason it's sitting here in the ranking is because I like the others more. Village plays a lot like a modern echo of Resident Evil 4. The pacing leans heavily towards the action, you're upgrading weapons, blasting through enemies, stacking up your ammo, and getting into much bigger fights than the slower survival horror style that the series started with and that got reborn with 7. But it still makes space for pure horror when it wants to. The best example is House Beneviento. Suddenly you're stripped of your gear and you're dropped into something far more unsettling. It's one of the most memorable sequences in the franchise for me personally. Structurally, Village feels almost like a horror theme park. The central village acts as a hub, and from there you branch out into completely different styles of horror. One path leads to gothic castles, another dives into psychological dread, and another towards industrial nightmare fuel. Each area has its own flavour, its own villain, and its own way of trying to ruin your day. And speaking of villains, this game has some fantastic ones. Lady Dimitrescu became an internet phenomenon before the game even launched, and yes, part of that was because the internet collectively decided that she was very appealing for reasons, completely normal reasons, but beyond the memes, she is a great presence in the castle section. The same goes for some of the other main villains. I don't think many of them have the same sort of personality and gravitas as Lady Dimitrescu, but I still think they bring their own twisted identity to their areas. Ethan obviously returns from Resident Evil 7, and while he functions perfectly well as the person you control, he's still a charisma vacuum. He reacts to all the chaos around him in a way that often feels very flat compared to the more colourful characters in the series. Despite that, the game is still ridiculously fun to play, the combat feels great, the pacing rarely drags, and the variety between each area keeps the adventure feeling quite fresh. Before we get into the next entry though, if you are enjoying this video, then may I interest you in a cheeky subscribe, as we're really close to reaching 2,000 subscribers, which would make me a very happy boy. Thank you very much, but anyways, on to the next entry. Next up, we have Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. In my opinion, the scariest game in the series. You can feel the inspiration from PT almost immediately with the pacing and the tight corridors and the way the game slowly builds dread instead of throwing constant horrors at you. It leans quite hard into the psychological horror, and for a franchise that had spent years drifting towards explosive action, it was a massive course correction that arguably saved the series. The first person perspective plays a huge role in all of this. Experiencing everything through the boring Ethan Winters' eyes changes the whole dynamic. When Jack Baker suddenly bursts through a wall at you or stomps around the house looking for you, the tension ramps up instantly because the distance between you and the threat suddenly feels much smaller. And the Baker family themselves are fantastic villains. Jack, Marguerite, Lucas, the whole household, beneath all the horror, their story is genuinely tragic. For a series that always leans into wild conspiracies and biological chaos, which this game still does, Resident Evil 7 actually manages to tell a focused story despite that. So if it's this scary and the story is this strong, why is it sitting here in the ranking? Well, there's two big reasons. The first one is the enemy variety is incredibly limited. You fight the moulded, then you fight more moulded, then a slightly different moulded shows up. Every so often you get a boss fight to shake things up, but then you go back to fighting, you guessed it, more moulded. In a series known for iconic creatures, that lack of variety really stands out here. And the second issue is the back half of the game. The Baker residence is phenomenal. Exploring that house, managing your resources, all of this stuff is peak survival horror. But once you leave the house, the game starts to lose some of its identity. The ship section and the mine section feel like they belong to a different experience entirely. The atmosphere completely changes. The pacing changes. A lot of the tension that made the opening chapters so gripping just completely fades away. It's a strange situation where the first 2/3 are some of the strongest horror the series has ever produced, and the final stretch really struggles to maintain that momentum. Even with those issues, I still feel that Resident Evil 7 deserves a lot of credit. It dragged the franchise back towards horror when it desperately needed it, and for a good chunk of the game, it's absolutely terrifying. Call it recency bias if you must, I don't care. This game is awesome. Requiem splits its campaign between Grace and Leon, and the difference in tone between them is immediately noticeable. Grace's sections are pure survival horror, first-person perspective, tight exploration, limited resources, and a structure that feels like the culmination of the classic Resident Evil formula. You start in a central hall, and from there, the game branches into two wings, each filled with its own puzzles, enemies, and secrets. Stop me if you've heard this before. That layout has been part of Resident Evil's DNA for decades, and here it feels perfected. Every time you unlock a shortcut, or finally open a new path back into the main hub, it feels like the map folding neatly back upon itself. The pacing, the tension, the exploration, all lands exactly where it should. It also features some fantastic stalker enemies during these segments. You're constantly weighing up whether you have time to search another room or if you need to move right now. And Grace herself is a brilliant addition to the series. She's vulnerable without feeling helpless, and the way she reacts to the horrors around her really sells the fear without overplaying it. Her sections are peak Resident Evil. If someone asked me what survival horror in this franchise looks like at its best, I'd probably point straight here. But then you switch to Leon. Leon's chapters lean very hard into action, with a lot of ammo, with a lot of enemies, and the pacing really speeds up. The survival horror tension takes a back seat, while the combat now takes centre stage. To be clear, this isn't necessarily bad, it's still fun to play. Leon has been doing this long enough that watching him dismantle monsters while throwing out sarcastic one-liners still works. But while Grace's sections felt like the pinnacle of survival horror, Leon's chapters don't quite reach that same peak for action horror. They often feel like a slightly weaker version of what Resident Evil 4 already nailed years ago. The combat is solid, but it doesn't quite hit that same magic. I also thought that the story was pretty fun with a lot of nice callbacks, and I really liked the introduction of Grace as a character. I hope we get to see a lot more of her. The whole game just sort of feels like a celebration of Resident Evil as a whole, and I just really enjoyed it. As a complete package, this is probably the best survival horror game the series has ever produced. One of the smartest things it does is how it treats its enemies. In a lot of games, the goal is simple: see monster, remove monster. Resident Evil 2 Remake flips that mindset. Zombies are not targets now, they are obstacles. You can kill them if you really want to, but ammo is limited, and the smarter play is often just to usually weave around them, stagger them with a shot to the leg, or go a different route. That constant resource management adds tension to every hallway. Every bullet matters, every encounter forces you to think about whether the fight is worth it. The puzzle design also taps straight into classic Resident Evil territory. Searching the police station for keys and medallions and hidden mechanisms feels fantastic because the map loops back on itself in really clever ways. And the boss fights are also great too. They're big messy encounters that force you to juggle movement, positioning and resource management. Story wise, I also feel this is another one of the few entries in the series where most things sort of hold together. The outbreak in Raccoon City, the Umbrella experiments, a catastrophe spreading through the police station all creates quite a strong narrative backbone. And then there's Mr. X. Mr. X is easily one of the best stalker enemies in gaming, just following you around the police station doing everything he possibly can to make your life a living hell. The only real complaint I have with Resident Evil 2 Remake is how the Leon and Claire campaigns are handled. The game encourages multiple playthroughs, one where you can go through Leon's sort of experience through the RPD, and then another where you go through it as Claire. But the overlap between the stories feels a bit awkward, with certain events happening in both routes in ways that don't fully line up. I really think they should have done more with this. But even with that small issue, the overall experience is phenomenal. If somebody asked me where to start with Resident Evil today, this would probably be my answer. I think it captures the essence of survival horror perfectly, while feeling much more modern and accessible, as much as I do love RE1. And finally, sitting comfortably at the top, we have Resident Evil 4 Remake. This one is a big deal for me because the original Resident Evil 4 is one of my favourite games of all time. That is a very dangerous starting point with a remake. When you love something that much, the new version usually has a mountain to climb, and somehow, I think the remake's better. The only complaint I have is that the It boss fight is now gone. Anybody who played the OG version remembers creeping through those cage walkways while that nightmare skittered around. Losing that section is a genuine shame, but aside from that, this remake is operating at an absurd level of quality. The gunplay feels incredible, every weapon has a distinct personality, whether you're lining up precise headshots with a rifle or blasting through a crowd with a shotgun. Enemies react dynamically to what you're doing, staggering, charging, regrouping. Combat constantly asks you to reposition, to manage space. It's just wow. And the enemy variety is also fantastic. Ganados behave differently depending on the situation, regenerators act as new threats later in the game. You're rarely dealing with the exact same scenario twice. Your arsenal also plays a huge role in this. You've got pistols, rifles, grenades, each weapon feeling useful in different circumstances. The level design also just ties everything together really well, with the villages and the castles and the laboratories. Every major location has its own identity and its own combat rhythm. Some areas push you toward more positioning, while others will just force quick reactions, and the boss fights, absolute cinema. Now, generally speaking, I do prefer Resident Evil when it leans more into the survival horror aspect, but if you're going to go down the action horror route, you might as well do it perfectly, and that is exactly what this game does. So that is my ranking of all the modern Resident Evil games. What would your ranking be? Please let me know in the comments, as I'd love to argue with you all, but for now, that is everything. If you enjoyed the video, then leaving a like or a comment telling me you liked it would really make my day, and if you want to see more videos from me, subscribing is always a great option. We've also recently enabled memberships on the channel, so if you wanted to support the channel and get access to early videos, then that is always an option, but alas, that is all for now. Have a nice day, and goodbye.